Hello and welcome back to Parley. This one was paid for by vampbug. If you're not them, I hope you'll enjoy listening. Vampbug asks for some discussion about making your own D&D wiki. Have you done that already? How exactly did you or would you document that? Some big changes are coming with D&D 1, so I may be looking to start molding my own tabletop role-playing game out of D&D. Any talk is helpful. Sure, let's begin by answering the questions you asked. Making your own D&D wiki. Have you done that already? Yeah, it's something I'm working on with my playgroup. We're interested in using Foundry Virtual Tabletop and a wiki that I currently think is really useful, 5e Tools, 5e dot tools, which integrate. So our hope is that we can use that as a base, change what we want, and we'll be good to go. By the way, I don't have any legal stance on whether using, I don't know, tools like 5e tools is okay. It's complicated because these are just pieces of game design you're using, but they come from books that cost money, some of which I've bought and some of which I haven't. So I'm not making a legal statement about whether that is or isn't good. I'm just pointing out that it is a thing people do, and I'm commenting on maybe why and how you might want to do that. So yeah, let's leaving that aside. How exactly did you or would you document that? Well, I would recommend documenting it. If you make changes to a piece of design from a source, I'd recommend writing down what source it's from. 5e Tools actually has that, so it'll say what book it's from, for example. And if you change something, I think it's good to jot down what and why you changed it. It might be something you'll change differently later, and people who are coming from a different understanding of a system will, be able to understand that change better that way. But really, it's this end part that I want to spend a lot of time on. Some big changes are coming with D&D 1, you said, so you're maybe looking to start molding your own tabletop role-playing game out of D&D. Kind of two things here. First of all, there's some discussion to be had about why it even matters that some changes are coming. So I want to talk about that a little. If you don't think it is useful or necessary to make your own D&D wiki or something similar, I hope to convince you that it is useful to do that. Probably not vampbug, they seem already convinced. And second, I do want to have a word about making your own tabletop role-playing game. Actually, let's just say that first. I'm going to talk mostly in this parlay about taking the data that players would use to make their characters, that DMs would use to decide on monsters and encounters and loot and stuff, and making a wiki about that stuff. The basic rules of the game are either something that if you're playing with a single playgroup, they probably already know, or if you're going to bring this to unknown playgroups or new playgroups, you probably want to write down separately or demonstrate somehow. Maybe it's good to have that be separate. So I'm not going to talk too much about that. Certainly, if you do mold your own tabletop role-playing game out of another, you'd want to do what we're going to talk about in this parlay. You just want to do other stuff too, and I'll talk a little bit about how you might choose that. With the first part, the first thing I mentioned, why? Some people might be thinking, why? There's really no need to make a wiki. Like you just said, Zandy, there is a wiki available that has, the spells or class features or whatever that I use, you might be thinking. Well, I want to begin from the position of asking why it matters, what the official D&D rules are. Well, it could get you on the same page as other people. The reason for rules, after all, is to be on the same page with other people. In some games, like American soccer, football elsewhere in the world, the rules are there so that you can know what is permissible or not in the game. The game doesn't have significance if people can just break a rule without knowing. The rules are strict. In Dungeons and Dragons, though, the game is, well, I guess soccer is also pretend if you put it that way. But the game is pretend. It's not a video game in that you have to find out a rule, something that happens whether you know it or not. And it's not flexible whether it happens, but you just may or may not know it. The rules are there in D&D and games like it, really to get people on the same page, get the same expectations for each of the players. What type of, what level of balance is acceptable? What type of damage can I expect from an effect or enemy? Stuff like that. And also because mathematically, you can save a lot of time balancing if things are balanced under similar math. So in other words, if monsters have say they have a challenge rating or a level, and that level has been balanced for, characters in Dungeons and Dragons using those rules for armor class and health and stuff, you could rest assured that they're going to be relatively balanced. I actually haven't had very good experiences with that, but they're not completely irrelevant to the balance level of characters in that system, right? But the big one is making sure that you and the players you're playing with are on the same page, of course. If you're the DM and your players are under a misconception about what rules you plan to enforce, that's not going to be fun for them, possibly. They will be unpleasantly surprised to find that this doesn't work the way they thought. They'll try to do something cool like knock an enemy off of a building, and knowing whether you would rule that a certain way is good. It will cause them to not be disappointed if they try to do something. They might feel like their circumstances are unfair because they interpreted something one way, but you interpreted it another way. And discussing that for every single context is basically impossible. It would take longer than playing D&D, and so having a set of rules is good. Again, that might seem rudimentary, but the reason I wanted to go through the time to emphasize that or explain that is that I think it's important to remember when changing rules. There should be a goal, I think, and I'm not saying that that's hard. There are a lot of goals, but yeah, you can get on the same page for a group of people you don't know that might want to play together. You can say like we're using the published, current, up to date fifth edition rules, and that isn't one thing. There are some parts of that by the game designer's own admission, the wording is quite vague, not even really intended to be a single interpretation, but at least there is a common text people are working from. It's much better than nothing, right? That's those rules of the game that we can refer to. If you have no other set of rules, then you need to refer to some set of rules. Even if they aren't as clear or monolithic as people often act like they are, they're not, but it's a lot better than nothing, sure. However, I think if you're in any other situation, it is better not to use the official rules. In fact, if we define playing Dungeons and Dragons as following the official rules, I don't like that game. I don't think it's good. I would actually argue it isn't good, period. Not just that I don't like it. It is very general. Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition has a lot of motivations wrapped into it that are not designed to be fun. They're designed to appeal to a large audience or not set off too many people at once. Many wordings are vague, as I mentioned before, sometimes because they're meant to hold on to something that some players might view as traditional, while allowing flexibility for people that don't care about that tradition or for whom that doesn't make sense, which it would be better if you just had it the way that you wanted it. If you know you prefer one or another of those things, it would be better to just see that piece of design and make it be the one you prefer. Something being general and then using that as a specific authority obviously doesn't work that well. It'd be better to specify it the way that you want. So that's basically the thing I'd suggest doing with a wiki. And the benefit is that if you're in any situation other than playing with completely random strangers, which having a pickup group can be fun, I don't play D&D that way, but if you do that, that's a time when it would be valuable. But if you do anything else, you already are using like some rules, people homebrew things, and codifying them can be really good. It allows you to make changes that would be very difficult to express by just quickly telling people what rules changes you use. For example, if you sit down at a table, you could say, this is the version of the flanking rules I'm going to use. Instead of giving someone advantage, I'm going to give you +1 per someone flanking, because I think flanking is too strong if you get advantage. And people would be like, all right, cool. Otherwise, it's the exact same thing we're used to, even though it probably isn't. Let's play. But you can make changes that I think are worth making, but would be way too granular to discuss in that context if you're willing to just make your own wiki. If people reference the Cloud of Knives spell, is that what it's called? Cloud of Daggers? Cloud of Knives? I think a kind of underpowered area control spell. And a player looks that up and sees that it's a bit different. You can just write a little note that says, hey, this is originally from this book in this game. I buffed it and changed it to this. So because I think there aren't that many strong area control spells at low levels, it still covers a small area, but it does a lot of damage. Have at it, that kind of thing. That could be very effective, but you can see how that really wouldn't fit well into like a beginning of game discussion. You can't just say it's a house rule when you make dozens of small but very warranted, give the players lots of options type of changes to the game. You really just can't do that verbally. It's too confusing for people to follow. Having a wiki where you can is much easier, and if you have a system by which you can simply start with the default list of spells you like and then change a bunch of details rather than needing to rewrite every single spell, that's also very easy. It just doesn't take that long, which I think is most of the reason people wouldn't do this. It's hard to argue that it's not good. Like if I said I'll snap my fingers right now and you'll have your homebrew codified into your own personal tabletop role playing game wiki, would you say no? Why? You know what I mean? The problem would be the effort it would be perceived as taking. People must feel like some combination of their amount of homebrew isn't so high and the amount of effort isn't so low that they're willing to take the plunge and make their own thing. But I'm here to argue that you probably would homebrew more if you had this, and it might take less effort than you think. So even though people I think are thinking it's maybe balanced like this, I think the effort it takes is actually a little lower than they think, and the value is maybe a little higher than it would seem. They've been not making changes because they don't have this type of thing. These players I'm referring to, hopefully you, listener, somebody who I'm talking to directly, you could make more changes that would make the game more fun in a way that would be usable if you had your own wiki to reference. And having a system like Foundry, where hopefully the wiki can be integrated into the player's search, interface. So when they search for a spell with their virtual tabletop, they just get the version of the list of spells that you've made with balance changes and stuff, and it just works. And most of the changes you've made are probably just like damage tweaks or like wording clarification. That sounds minor, but I don't think it is. I'll get to in a second. It's easy. It just works. So that is the type of thing I'm going to do. You said what type of documentation am I interested in putting in? And basically, it would be like a breadcrumb trail. Where did this come from? Why did I make those changes, etc. I may come back and change the changes later, stuff like that. And yeah, it should be that straightforward. Just some thoughts about what you might change. I think that's worthwhile. I spent about half of the parlay talking about why and kind of how you might change things. Now maybe you could talk a little bit more about what to change. Again, as I mentioned at the top of the parlay, I'm not really tackling the I think larger subject of changing rules, like fifth edition's rules, for example, or D&D 1 rules or whatever. I'm mostly suggesting making your own wiki, which is a list of, I guess, like data to use during play, class features, items, monsters, spells, stuff like that, races, species, backgrounds, so that when something is added to Dungeons and Dragons, you don't have to include it by default for lack of any other rule set that you can use. You have another rule set, so things are excluded by default. And then if the designers make a piece of design that you feel is motivated by fun instead of just changing things for the sake of it, which is how I feel a lot of it is, to be perfectly blunt, then you can include it. And it's just very easy. You don't have to be at the mercy of how the game is changed. And again, I think a lot of those changes are simply not motivated by gaminess, game design fun. They're motivated by marketing. That's not evil, it's just less good than it could be for you, the player. It's needlessly inferior to something better. It's not wicked to give the player some variety. It's just probably not as much fun for you as it would be if you could choose whether you wanted that variety. Um, I'll be honest, I am actually a little more severe about it. I think that a lot of the Dungeons and Dragons development and marketing is really frustrating. Kind of again, it's not evil, but kind of irresponsible in a mundane but still frustrating way. I feel like even if you wanted to make a game broad just to appeal to a lot of people and provide variety, just to, I don't know, keep it fresh or shake things up for people. You could do it in a way that was better game design than they do, not very difficultly. It wouldn't be very hard to do it, to do those things which I don't want in my game, but fine, you want them. I feel like you could still kind of just do them better. But whatever, and kind of outside the topic of this video. But my point is that I'm interested in changing my experience, not because the core rules are necessarily gonna get changed in a way I dislike. I actually don't think that's a problem for almost anyone. Some people just kind of default to the authority. They don't have enough faith in their own explanation of why design would be good or bad. And so if they, for example, remove dungeon masters getting crits, that was a proposed change. And some people said they like that, some people said they don't. That's a very easy change to just tell your group at the beginning of a session, hey, I am going to have monsters crit when they would crit. I just think it's silly not to. It adds tension. Yeah, I don't think there's a good reason not to do that. I feel they did that just to provide variety and say something extreme that caught people's attention and made them want to weigh in. That's what I think. And your players might understandably say, oh yeah, okay, totally. Or somebody might say, well, I don't like that because I keep getting one-shotted by things critting me. And then you and that player could have a discussion based on your reasoning. You shouldn't be worried that that's like gonna break the game or something, because big professional game designers put it in the game. Like it might, but as long as you're reasonable with the people you play with, I think that will be fine. It's not like a video game where you might change some piece of design and you don't even know what parts of the game that's going to break, literally, technically, like they just won't work. That's a much more esoteric thing. That's easy to change. And the people who aren't willing to decide what they want to do about that and will just default to whatever the official D&D source materials say are not going to be convinced to make their own wiki. I also largely like the core, like the very core rules. I think that the list of skills is mostly where I want it to be. It's useful to me. Rolling a d20 suits my group's tastes pretty well. I like starting with a pretty random determiner of the outcome of an attack or an attempt at some social interaction or whatever, picking a lock. I like starting with something very random and then being able to build your character to be reliable, but not necessarily that much actually better at it. A lot of tasks you can't do much better than a 20, I would argue. So getting a plus 10 to picking a lock that is a 20 to open just means that you pick the lock more consistently, rather than that you're like better at picking locks exactly. I guess that is consistency, but you see what I mean. The focus of the way my group plays is more like that. So I really like the randomness of rolling a d20 combined with the consistency of building what your character is reliable at, and the rest of it they're inconsistent. People do amazing things all the time, but not consistently. Professionals aren't much, better, faster, whatever, stronger than other people. In real life, they're consistent, I would argue. That's mostly what sets them apart. And I think that's fun. I actually think that that's a pretty good low fantasy aesthetic. A lot of people treat Dungeons and Dragons like the player characters are superheroes, but I feel that this system is actually pretty good for an aesthetic of relatively mundane, you are a leaf on the wind that doesn't matter at all, good luck surviving out there, which my playgroup and I have decided we enjoy. But you absolutely could change stuff. I just think it's important to set that apart from making your own wiki where you might make major balance changes, but that don't really change like the flavor of the game. Do you see what I mean? So for example, I've always been fascinated by the spell Witch Bolt. Witch Bolt is a first level spell for some arcane spellcasters. And the idea is that you no, you will die. And lightning comes out. And if it hits, it does very good damage for that level over time, because you can, on subsequent rounds, use your action to keep the lightning on and do more damage again. So you can be increasing your damage per round with the spell. But the damage when you activate it on subsequent rounds does not scale. If you upcast the spell, if you keep the spell to higher levels and cast it at a higher level, the initial damage goes up, but the ongoing damage does not, and the spell is almost always mathematically inferior to other options with the initial damage only, which for some players don't think is good. They would want to buff it. But I don't think that's necessarily a problem. You can retrain spells or swap spells that are prepared fairly readily in 5th edition, and my group uses those rules. And so it can be viewed as a low level powerhouse spell. And even then, it's not that it's so raw powerful, it makes your resources more efficient, I guess. It can be very good on a warlock, for example, to stretch one spell slot a little further. It's not amazing, but it does increase your damage if used that way. That can be useful. I don't think that's bad. So I'm not sure I'm going to buff its damage or make it scale. Although I do think the range you have to stay in to keep the beam attached feels very low, like ungenerous, not very high. It seems quite unlikely that you'd be able to get really any damage out of it more than the first round without putting yourself in mortal peril if you're a class that can learn this spell. And because this is apparently a low level spell, according to my evaluation, you probably haven't multi-classed to become very tanky yet, if you were going to do that. So yeah, squishy. So I might change the spell's range, like stuff like that. But making it, a guaranteed hit or do way more damage that scales may change the game in other ways that I'm not sure I want. Making spell slots really efficient, like making that too good, and there's this spell available in the game that just kind of lets you use a spell slot for the whole fight to do lots of damage from level 1, is kind of a change to the sort of metagame mechanically of 5th edition. I feel like that's more of a different type of change. I'm not saying that's bad, necessarily. For the right group, it could be really fun, but it doesn't really fit the tone, mood, flavor, I'm not sure, of the thing that my group and I are doing. So I think that if you were gonna make rules, like also a rules document, and make changes like that to a lot of spells, that was a simple example, not too crazy. But if you made a lot of changes like that, you could get into a version of 5th edition spell list where a lot of spells were really reliable value engines, which most of them aren't at the moment. Like, that's pretty rare. I would want to write that down. Like, if I made a tabletop role-playing game document, I might say a lot of spells are reliable value engines, which again, I think they currently mostly aren't in 5th edition. And you might decide another common change people make is instead of rolling 1d20, they roll 3d6. We've talked about this lots in previous D&D themed Parley. This gives you the same range of results as rolling a d20, but the middle results are much more common, so you've made the player much more consistent. I explained earlier that I actually don't want that. Like, I want it to be inconsistent, but you can craft it to be consistent for the things you want to be consistent at. Not ludicrously inconsistent, of course. There are lots of ways my players can support each other. You can use guidance on someone. One of the many things we've changed is somewhat revamped the way that you can just spam guidance on everything. There's much more clear rules for, if you're surprised or you make a check that the player isn't prompting the check, you can't just use guidance all of a sudden to get a d4 to that check. And it being concentration or having kind of a cooldown makes it much more meaningful. Players noticing magic being cast by other people, enforcing verbal and somatic components, has been fun for us as a way to it helps balance a lot of spells. But if you didn't want that, and you instead wanted checks to just be more consistent, instead of taking that other approach, which we find more immersive, and it's a little bit low power, which we kind of enjoy, I would just want to say why you changed that. I think a lot of players will be amenable to, they're used to rolling a d20. If you explain why you think they should roll something else, I think a lot of players will be responsive to that. There's perfectly good reasons to do it different ways. For example, something I'm experimenting with is proficiency dice. This is a fairly common change to 5th edition. The reason for this change is not that it is more or less random. It's not more or less random by that much in my evaluation. It's because I think it helps with math for some types of players. In 5th edition, to briefly explain, this is kind of outside the scope of this parlay, but this is what I can think of to talk about. You might make a check, and let's say I want you to look around. So I'll say make a perception check. The way the game is written by default, most people would roll a d20, and then add their wisdom. Perception says it's a wisdom skill, so they add their wisdom modifier. And if they're proficient in perception, if their character has that specific skill they've chosen out of a few options, then they would also add their proficiency bonus, which is based on character level overall. So it's not very much math. If you use a virtual tabletop, you just add the number it says. You roll let's roll. I rolled a 15, and let's say I add a 7. I am proficient, and I'm level 5, so I have +3, right? I think. And I'm a wisdom spellcaster, so I have +4, so my total bonus is that's +8. So I get a 15 plus 8, which is 23. It's not that much math. You just add your proficiency bonus, which is a number you would kind of get used to knowing. It's always that same number, to your statistical modifier relevant to that skill. Perception is wisdom, and then you add that to your roll. Not a big deal. But I have experienced that a lot of players are some players are a lot more comfortable with the tactile feeling of rolling 2 dice and then adding only one number from one place. So having a proficiency die, a d4 if you have 2 proficiency, a d6 if you have 3 proficiency, it makes the game slightly less reliable. The average of those die is slightly higher than the proficiency by only a very small amount. The average roll of a d6 is a little bit higher than 3. It's like 3.5. So it's a tiny buff to proficiency. It makes the game a little less reliable, but almost only at rather high levels. When the players are already more reliable, and I believe there's a pretty large cognitive load decrease, and it's fun to roll more die. It doesn't feel like it's in line with my previous design decision to make the game more about being reliable at things you're good at and everything else is unreliable, rather than you're like uber good at things all the time if you're good at them and you're not as good at things reliably if you're bad at them. It seems like I said I want to let the player remove randomness by building their stats and proficiencies to be reliable at things they want, but then I added back in randomness by making there be proficiency dice. But mathematically, I didn't really add that much randomness, and it only gets more random when players reach ludicrously high skill levels. Like, it's only very random when a player has, expertise, so they're rolling the die twice, and they need to get a very high number. That's the only point at which it's random, and that should be hard according to my design. So stuff like that, like I don't think those are bad types of changes to make if they would make your game more fun, or do the exact opposite of what I said because you think you hate that. Cool, that's good. Make those changes. But I'm not sure that putting them in a wiki. Let me put it this way. If you were gonna make changes unlike that one I just said that would really change the math of the game, that's where I think you should be careful. Changing the simple ability numbers on a skill may be okay. Changing something like how easy it is to get more value out of the spell slot, with the understanding like I have played every spellcasting class in 5th edition, and I understand them all from a game design perspective. So the implications of making Witch Bolt easier to get value out of are largely limited to warlocks. It can also be a little powerful if you're a sorcerer and you use twin spell with it. That could be a little strong, but you only get that at 3rd or 4th level depending on how you use meta magic. So Witch Bolt is already getting slightly power crept at that point. That seems probably fine. And again, I can change it because we have the wiki. If it's out of control. But all I've done there is change the, damage numbers a little, or how much value you get out of it a little. Just things like that. Very small changes. Not things like everyone gets double proficiency all the time. That is a big change. Like, mathematically, that changes a lot of inherent balance of the game and makes like a lot of spells that make you more accurate when hitting an enemy with a spell or attack are much weaker all of a sudden, because it becomes extremely easy to hit like low level enemies. If your proficiency is doubled, especially like in the middle levels, you'd become incredibly reliable. Your player characters will almost never miss. Enemies may or may not double proficiency. Sometimes enemy stat sheets, it can be unclear where they're getting proficiency. Anyway, that's a big change. I'm not saying that's bad, But that's like at that point, you might need to overhaul some of the game balance. That's not the same as just making some modest balance changes. And lastly, I'll finish this parlay by talking a bit about clarity, which is something I kind of talked about earlier but didn't get into examples for. The place where I'm making the most changes personally, and maybe what I should have led with as one of the good value adds for making your own wiki, is that it will almost certainly make your gameplay faster. Here's an example. If a spell has a wording that makes it kind of ambiguous, whether it would be used in a certain way, whether it can be used in a certain way, you can just add examples. You don't even have to add them in the body of the spell. You could add a note that just adds some examples. You could even have a repository of videos where you say examples to the screen. Your camera phone that you have, audience member listening right now, it's real good. Like it ain't bad. Like modern smartphone camera phones, it really isn't bad. You could record it on that, or almost all of you watching up a webcam. You can download OBS and make a video for it. You don't have to do that. It's just an example. When those spells would come up and create discussion about whether you can or can't do something, you can just add those details. Even more than that, it's like a lot of creativity might be shut down by players reading ambiguous wording that, again, I think the developers of 5th edition left in to not upset anyone or like not bother anyone's sensibilities or whatever, but it is a bad way to word it. No one really benefits from it being worded that way. My favorite pet example for this is druids and their armor proficiencies. The druid armor proficiencies say medium armor, and then in parentheses it says druids will not wear metal armor or armor made of metal, use weapons and armor made of metal, something like that. Nowhere else in 5th edition is any restriction worded that way. Generally, they're worded, to be fair, actually pretty consistently not that way. They'll say something like, as long as you're not wearing blank armor, like heavy armor, you can fly. You have a flying speed of 30 feet as long as you don't wear heavy armor or whatever. As long as you're wielding a one-handed weapon and no other weapons, you can do blankety blank. It's usually worded like that, which makes it abundantly clear you cannot do the thing unless you meet this condition, or this turns on when you meet this condition. When you are wielding da 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 da, etc. Only in this one place do they word it that way. And I swear to you that the reason is probably because they don't want to offend the people who consider it tradition that druids can't wear metal, but also they understand that some players at this point don't think it makes sense that druids can't wear metal. So they're, why? Why not say something like, if druids wear, you could add it under druidic, the druidic feature. They know that language of the forest, of the druids. As druids carry around more artifacts of industrialized society, they begin to lose their connection to nature. They may be unable to read druidic. They might even be unable to cast or prepare different spells. That is still vague, but it makes it clear that we mean there are druid ability related consequences to, wearing artifacts of society, whatever that means. It also leaves it open for interpretation to the DM what those changes are, which I would argue is a more successful design than leaving it so vague. Like, what happens if druids won't wear metal armor? Are you trying to say you cannot be a druid character unless your character is a person who holds the opinion that they would... How far will they go to not wear metal armor? You know what I mean? Like, it just provides no guidance at all. That's fine, but it's inferior to a design that provides guidance you want. It's just like, why not provide guidance the player wants? And you can see that it can only be because they're either lazy, or I think more likely because they don't want to upset anyone. And so they basically just said nothing, which is a compromise that nobody likes, but that doesn't hurt anyone, I guess. But it's bad. Another thing you could do is say that their armor proficiencies are light armor and hide. Hide is the medium armor that is definitely not made of metal. Scale mail is something I've had players misunderstand or interpret, you could say, as being like armor made of beast scales. Scale mail, I am nearly certain they mean, is like the metal plate scales that interlock, like, they shingle down. They're like shingles. And then you usually wear leather under it so it doesn't scratch you up and stuff. And it's fairly flexible and mobile while still protecting you because you have metal sheets on your chest, but it's pretty loud and you get disadvantage for wearing scale mail in game. You could interpret it as monster scales, monster armor. That's cool. You know, it would be cool if the game made it clear if druids can wear medium armor, but just they need to seek out medium armor that is not made of metal that provides the same protection. Or it's a philosophy thing. How do druids even get their powers? Is their connection with nature about them? If the druid doesn't believe that metal is artificial, then do they is it okay? Or is it strictly about the periodic table of elements composition of the stuff? Is that even a thing in the world that this game is taking place in? Again, you could interpret it however you want. There are lots of cool ways to rule that, and none of them are the way they've written it. That's basically what I'm trying to say. And I feel like this is true of nearly every feature in 5th edition. They're either worded in a way that would be clear if that same type of thing wasn't worded differently elsewhere, or it's just hilariously unclear and it makes no sense. And you could easily make it clearer. Like, there's really no reason you couldn't just write it to be a way you consider to be clear. I think that that's much better than trying to argue that one way is or isn't the interpretation. The developers have even officially said that they don't even intend there to be like a single correct interpretation for most of the rules, which, like, that's not good for you. Like, it'd be better if you had and wrote down the interpretation you plan to use so that when your players read a feature, they just know what to expect. Yeah. Also, we're not going to even get into this, but just to dip my toe, if druids can or can't wear most medium armor, that is a significant balance change to the druid class. After all, being able to wear, better medium armor confers a fairly significant armor class bonus that at medium levels is essentially free. Like, it will cost a moderate amount of gold that they'll have. So can I or can't I put on a breastplate and jump my AC up 4 points? Yes or no, DM? It matters. Druids are damn squishy if you decide they don't do that. There is a popular Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition kind of character building, character optimization website called RPGbot that assumes that druids cannot wear any armor better than hide, which I understand, because the way it's worded ambiguously, you're kind of forced to assume that the player might be subject to those rules. If you play a random unknown game of D&D with the one set of rules that everyone understands, the official rules, which we've established that that actually isn't a thing, but you know what I'm talking about. Let me ask you, will you be allowed to play a druid that can wear, a breastplate or not? The answer is you don't know. So you might build your character needing to assume the worst version of that feature. Do you see how that's bad or less fun than if you could assume what you're going to get? Why can't I just know what AC my character is going to have? Again, it's fine for it to be a little unreliable. You might not even be a mechanically interested player. You don't have to know exactly what benefits your character will get, but I'm not going to force you to commit to a character archetype and give you no idea how high your defenses are going to be. That's like, why? Why? Like, does that make it fun for anyone? Like, why is that making it more fun for anyone? So, I think that's enough. I hopefully gave a good enough example of something I think is needlessly unclear. There's a lot of other examples, things like Unseen Servant is a spell that's come up a lot before. Doing things like I didn't really get into this in this parlay, but something you could get into would be spells like Augury, where a lot of players don't think Augury is a very good spell. The DM could just say, give no response for like an unreasonably large variety of things. And I feel that's really more about getting confidence with your play group. I am not out to screw you over. I want a tense narrative. You want a tense narrative. We're not trying to build cheese against each other. We're trying to build mutually understood mechanics so that the game is exciting for each other. So it isn't too easy or hard. No one is trying to screw anyone over. I love you guys, I would say to my players. Of course I wouldn't do that because I've known them for 10 years. But if you play with random people you don't know, I'm not sure what to do with that. Anyway, you could include something in the wording. You could say, even just wording it as the DM should make every possible attempt to give a response, but if it is not possible, they can give no response. Even just wording it that way puts a bit more pressure on the DM to like be a good person about it. You see what I mean? I'm not sure that really solves the problem, but I don't, it doesn't make it worse. Like, I don't think that that is a worse version of the game. You could change things like that. Um, Giving spells cooldowns. This is a big game mechanic introduction that I've considered for a long time. I think that material components that cost money are one thing, but sometimes this leads to the players, they will be able to cast the spell as much as they want. They just need to spend all their time farming, basically, which isn't always a better gameplay experience. Spells that you would feel bad if you weren't casting every day, but would be frustrating to acquire the materials to cast every day. You could just free the player from that by literally making it so you cannot cast it every day. That's an example. Ceremony is a spell I always give as an example. It encourages players to get statistical bonuses by committing things about their character's personality, like getting married to be more powerful for a dungeon, which for a lot of groups is not a problem at all. They won't do that. But even actually my group wouldn't do that. But I just despise that spell, and I see no benefit. Like, so if you're not going to abuse it anyway, why don't we just make that a role playing thing? Just get rid of it. It's one less thing to read. There are a lot of spells that I think are just redundant or from source materials that don't really make sense alongside the other things in D&D. Backgrounds like the ones from Strixhaven, that are they part of the one set of rules that everyone agrees to when they sit down at an unknown table of D&D players? I don't know. I don't know. But if you're not under the impression they are, but one other player at the table is allowed to use them, well, they're going to be super overpowered because you get a lot of spellcasting from those backgrounds. It's better if they're not included by default. That's my whole pitch for this parlay. I think that really is all I have to say. So I hope that gave you some guidance, some opinions that you can vehemently disagree with if you so wish, for how you might like to make your own Dungeons and Dragons or some other wiki. And if you are going to make it into your own fully fledged tabletop role playing game, to some mild place to start. But I did want to emphasize how I think those are fairly different undertakings. The biggest thing I would want to close on is just that I don't think you can really play Dungeons and Dragons or other tabletop role playing games without building them a little yourself. There is no playing D&D just rules as written while making no interpretations. You are interpreting it a certain way. Enough of the wording is unclear that you cannot play it without interpreting it a certain way. I'm just encouraging embracing that more to make a game that is more tuned to what you like and to escape the not really motivated by your fun design decisions that the developers of this game make. It's better to take a specific version of it that works better for you rather than the needlessly general for you version that is the official text or whatever. Yeah, go forth and build craft.